One of the challenges with software is that making it more powerful often makes it more difficult to use. With TriggerNote, that problem is solved using a feature called Recipes. Let me show you how they work. We'll start by creating a new trigger set and selecting the Exit Hover recipe. Most recipes will have a few options that you can set. For example, in this recipe, you can set the maximum number of times that the Exit Hover will be displayed on each page, the amount of time to wait after showing the Exit Hover before showing it the next time, and this is in milliseconds, so divide the number by 1000 and you get the number of seconds. And finally, the URL from which to load the content of the hover message. And I'll show you more about that a little later. When you click Apply Recipe, the options that you've selected are injected into the recipe and a whole bunch of TriggerNote settings are generated. And you don't need to look at these, you don't need to know what they do, although we will take a look at them later. But for now, let's just give this trigger set a name, save it, and put it to use. I'll copy the number of the new trigger set that we created, number 30, and then let's open up our test page and paste that number into the TriggerNote code. Now we'll save that, reload the web page, and then as you can see, as I move the mouse up out of the browser window, for example, if I were going to the address bar to type in another URL, or to the back button to go back to a Google search, or going to my bookmarks or something like that, then the Exit Hover message is displayed. Now you'll notice that the box is way too wide for the message that we have here, and I'll show you how to fix that a little bit later. But as you can see, using the recipe, it's very easy to set up an Exit Hover message like this. Now you'll remember when I was applying the Exit Hover recipe, I entered the URL for this file, hover.html. This is the file that contains the HTML code for the contents of that hover message. And you can see that it's pretty simple, just a headline, a call to action, and a subscription form. You can create this code in any HTML editor and then just copy and paste the part of it that needs to go into the message and stick it in its own file, put it on your web server, and then TriggerNote can load it into the Exit Hover message. So now, for those who may be interested, let's go over all the settings that were generated by that recipe so that you can see how it works. First, let me collapse all the sections and then we'll take a look at them one at a time. The first thing that happens is when someone first loads the page, a number of setup steps are taken. And these are done as soon as all of the DOM content is loaded and parsed, or in other words, we're not waiting until all the images on the page are loaded and things like that before we do the setup steps. So first we create an element called TriggerNote Page Gray, which is a translucent block that covers the entire page to gray out everything behind the hover message. Next, we set the class of that block to TriggerNote No-Show, which makes it initially invisible. Then we also give it the class name TriggerNote Page Gray, which is what gives it all the attributes it needs to cover the screen and be translucent. Next, we create the box that the hover message will be displayed in, TriggerNote Hover. We also set its class to No-Show to make it invisible, and also give it the class name TriggerNote Hover, which positions it, gives it its border, and things like that. Next, we add an image to our hover box, and this is the X that sits up in the corner that you can click to close it. We give that image the class name TriggerNote Hover Closer, which is how we apply the attributes that are needed to position it up in the corner, and I'll also show you how we use that class name to close the hover message when the image is clicked. Next, we add another box inside the hover box, and this is the one that we're going to inject the content into. We can't easily inject it directly into the hover box itself without overwriting that X image that we used to close it. You'll notice when we're creating an element that we want positioned inside another element, we set this field, ID of element to move to the ID of the element that we want it to go inside. And finally, we load that file, hover.html, that I showed you just a minute ago, into a JavaScript variable named TriggerNote Hover Content. So now all the parts that we need are in place. Next, let's look at the trigger group that controls when the hover message is displayed. This trigger group has a couple of different triggers in it, and all of them have to be triggered in order for the message to be displayed. And as you can see, this will happen a maximum of 3 times because that's the option that we set when we applied the recipe. The first condition that needs to be met is that the current time has to be either at or after the time stored in the JavaScript variable TriggerNote Exit Hover Time. The next condition that has to be met is that the mouse needs to move into a box that's specified by all these numbers here. 00 is at the upper left corner of the browser window. 3000 is way out to the right at the top of the browser window. 3080 is 80 pixels down from the top of the browser window way out to the right, and 080 is 80 pixels down from the top of the browser window over to the left. The final condition that has to be met is that the mouse needs to move out of the browser window. So by combining those last two conditions, we know that the mouse is moving out of the top of the browser window and not out of the side or out of the bottom. And that's what we want, because that's where all of the things like the address bar, the back button, and the bookmarks menu are. All of the things that indicate that the visitor might be planning to leave your web page. So once all of those conditions are met, here are the actions that we take. First, we take the value of that JavaScript variable, TriggerNote Hover Content, and we inject it into the box inside the hover box, which is also called TriggerNote Hover Content. One of them is a JavaScript variable, the other is an HTML element ID, and so they can have the same name. Next, we remove the TriggerNote no-show class name from the hover box, which makes it visible. And then we remove the TriggerNote no-show class name from TriggerNote page gray, which makes that box that grays out the rest of the screen visible. Last, let's take a look at how we close the hover box. First, we watch for a click on any element whose class name is TriggerNote Hover Closer, which is the class name that we gave to that X that we put up in the corner. When we detect that click, we inject the current time plus 30 seconds, or 30,000 milliseconds, into the JavaScript variable TriggerNote Exit Hover Time. And that ensures that if someone closes the hover box and then immediately moves their mouse back up out of the window, we don't keep popping that message up over and over again in rapid succession. Next, we add the class name TriggerNote no-show back to the TriggerNote hover box, and then also to the TriggerNote page gray box. So as you can see, a fairly complicated set of TriggerNote settings can be controlled easily using that recipe that only has 3 options that you need to set. So next, let me show you how you can resize the hover message and get rid of this big empty space next to your content. Let me get into the TriggerNote folder and we'll open the main TriggerNote style sheet. As you can see, the TriggerNote hover class is defined here, and it includes settings for how wide the box is going to be and where it's going to be positioned. We position the left side halfway across the page, but then we give it a negative margin which pulls it half of the width back towards the left. So to resize this, what we need to do is override these settings. So we'll copy this code and then go into this file, userstyle.css, which is where you can put any CSS code you want to override TriggerNote's default settings. And in here we'll change the width to 320 pixels and set that left margin to minus 160 pixels, which is half of 320. And then, as you can see, if we reload the page, the hover box has been resized and the content fits much better. So that's one of our first recipes. The great thing about TriggerNote is that we can add an unlimited number of recipes to make anything that you want it to do easy. I'll be adding several more in the next few days, and as I get feedback from you about what you'd like TriggerNote to do, I'll keep adding more and you'll receive them all as free upgrades. I look forward to seeing how you'll use TriggerNote to make your websites more interactive, dynamic, and profitable. Thank you for watching.